So again, welcome everyone to our session, our research series this week. I want to welcome Dr. Diane Rogers. I'm Alicia Shadaman, the Executive Director or the Director of the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at Northern. We've been doing a series of research presentations like this throughout the year. We plan to do those about once a month. Sometimes we bring faculty from outside of NIU, and sometimes we profile our own associates. So Dr. Rogers is an associate professor in sociology, soon to be professor in sociology. And she's also an associate of the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at Northern. So we're really grateful that she's here with us to spend the next hour or so with us. And I'm grateful for all of you for being here as well. So Diane, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, I'll be monitoring the chat in the background. And I will go ahead and you should be able to share your screen. Right now, everyone is muted. You can put any questions that you have in the chat.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me talk today on children and social movements. I'm very excited about it. And again, yes, please put in questions that we can talk about during the discussion in the chat as they come up if you want. And let me get to this. I want to share my screen and let us pray to the technology gods that all will be well. All right, here we go. You can see my messy desktop here. What else do we have? Okay, here we go. All right, all good?
Looks great, Dan.
All right, good deal. I'm going to, let's see, reduce this a little bit. Yeah, all right. So, hold on one sec. There we are. All right, so yes, thank you again for the introduction. So let me just move on to the next slide here. I wrote this book on children and social movements because I wanted to highlight children and social movements and why they're so important. One of the things that happened as I did research in social movements was I realized there wasn't anything at all in social movement research on children specifically. But there are firsthand accounts, and occasionally there'd be a mention of a child in a social movement. So what I started thinking about is all of these cases piling up in my head. And I was like, what can we do with this? And I wanted to put those all together and talk about how we could study them. So one of the things that comes up with this is the idea of agency or taking children seriously as social actors. And that is one thing we'll talk a lot about today. And then another thing is, how do children get involved, or what we call mobilization? How do they get into social movements? And then, of course, children's rights. Now, I'll be using the definition of the child as 18 and under. That's provided by the UN, and this is just to provide consistency throughout the cases. Now, the historical scope of worldwide involvement of children in social movements is so inspiring. I mean, I really, hopefully I won't get too choked up during the presentation at times, because it's just amazing. And I wish I could share all the examples in the book with you, but I will just be sharing some, of course. How I took all of these cases from around the world and over time was to create a theoretical typology. And basically, these are just general characteristics that kind of fall into a pattern of participation. So the ones that emerged were strategic participation, participation by default, and active participation. And I'll explain each one of these next with some examples. Now, social movement organizations plan strategic actions to get their message across. They do this with adults and also with children. Some of these are specific to children, and I'm going to give you some examples here. The Industrial Workers of the World labor union organizers from the 1912 Lawrence, Massachusetts textile strike decided to send away some of the children of strikers to families out of town to be cared for. Now, they did this in a very conspicuous way with a marching band and carrying banners because they wanted to gain newspaper coverage as a strategy for attention for the strike. However, in the second round of children to be sent off, they were met with police and militia, and the mothers and children were beaten and arrested. This was covered by the press as well. And certainly this wasn't the intention of the strike organizers, but this did turn the public in their favor. Now the picture here is of the 1913 Patterson silk strike. Up in the upper right, you see the trolley that's taking the children with the children banner there. The industrial workers of the world carried this strategy out again after the one in Lawrence, Mass. So they thought that this was quite successful. Children's marches have been a frequent strategy used. One of the more well-known children marches happened in Birmingham, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference came up with a strategy to involve children as demonstrators. They wouldn't have to worry about losing their jobs, and they felt that then they would bring attention to the cause. Children volunteered for this strategy and became part of the planning. Unfortunately, this escalated beyond what the plan was as the authorities turned fire hoses and attack dogs on the children. This brutality against child protesters was captured by the media, and the reaction by the public unexpectedly brought outside support to the movement. Again, like the IWW labor organizer strategy, harm to children by authorities is not part of the plan. Now, children's marches appear to have sort of end up being in a lot of other movements as well. And in the book, I talk about as many of the ones that I could find. Here we have a picture of 2014 children in the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, in the fight for indigenous right in the upper left corner here. And we'll talk about that movement later. Now, in the lower right of your screen, you'll see some baby carriages with signs on them. And hopefully you'll notice that there's more than one there. There's a whole parade of these. And this is actually quite a common strategy, sometimes known as baby brigades. And another common strategy with children is the idea of incorporating play into the protest. And here in the middle, we see a Greenpeace protest about drilling in the Arctic with children using large size Legos. What's the point of the Legos? Legos had partnered with Shell, who was drilling in the Arctic. So they combined all of these things together. But again, other movements will use various ideas of play and children as a strategy. And these are just some of the strategic participant examples. There's other ones, but these are definitely very common. All right, so another way that you'll see children in social movements is what I call participants by default. And this type of participation is a little bit complex to figure out at times. Let's look at this one picture on the left here of babies in carriages again, okay? But here is just one couple bringing their babies in a carriage. It's not part of the social movement strategy. It wasn't planned or anything. And so sometimes, of course, parents might just bring their children out of convenience or because they do want them to be a part of it. And so another common sight that you'll see at protests is the children on the shoulders of adults, like in this protest for immigrant rights in the upper right corner. This doesn't automatically imply a participant by default, but it definitely falls into that quite a bit. Now, this is a good place for me to stop a second and talk about how do I judge these patterns by the pictures. I don't just do it by the pictures. You have to also look at the context, what's written or said, either by participants or social movement organizers or the movement itself, and how they involve children or not. Now, another example of participants by default that makes it a little more complicated is this picture on the bottom. This is an anti-gay marriage protest in France. Families will bring an entire group of siblings, and some of these siblings are more involved or more aware than other siblings. So typically in a whole group of siblings, you'll have some of those who are participants by default and have just been sort of brought along with the family. Now, active participants consciously and voluntarily involve themselves in social movements. Now, this is seems to be pretty clear to define, but it definitely is overlooked or sometimes denied that children are actively participating in social movements. Sometimes also we don't necessarily see children actively participating. They may not be out in protest. We sometimes think that is the only thing that is happening in social movements, but they can be helping through sign making, flyers, mailing, etc. Now, an example comes from the reflections of Mary Louise Patterson, a child of parents who were members of the Communist Party. Now, these former children are known as red diaper babies. Here's her account. I grew up going to meetings and demonstrations, learning how to make stencils, running mimeograph machines, collating, stapling, stuffing, and sealing envelopes. Most of the time, I enjoyed participating, feeling a part of some great, invincible, yet clandestine force. Now, children making their own signs for protests typically are showing an awareness of their intentions, as seen in this example of a Black Lives Matter protester and the protest banner to the left of the Kids Are Revolting. The banner was made by a kids block of protesters against the G8 meeting in Scotland 2005, and they planned their own protest there. The presence of children's organizations, as we see in the bottom two pictures here, the Federation of Workers' Children organization, and also the picture on the left is of an apartheid protest. These are children in marches, but aren't organized by the social movement adult organizers, but by the children themselves. And we'll discuss the apartheid marches later. Now, this last category of active participant in particular, it relies on this notion that children can be social and political actors. Okay, so here's our chat moment. With this in mind, and don't cheat, don't ask Alexa or go online, please put in the chat the name of any children in social movements that you can think of off the top of your head, okay? You're not going to get extra credit or any kind of prize, but just off the top of your head, any names of children in social movement. Go ahead and drop that into the chat. All right, now we'll get back on to that. My ideas are inspired from the literature known as children's culture, childhood studies, children's studies, and all of this emerged in the 1990s. And this is where the idea of children being capable of having agency emerged. You didn't really see that in the social movement research at the time. So the whole idea of children as being rather than only becoming, and the children's studies literature challenged the whole developmental model of children's cognitive abilities. And this actually helps quite a lot when you think about them in the whole idea of social movements. Okay, do we have some results from our chat? Alicia?
Yep. So we have, you knew this one was going to come up, Malala.
Okay. Yes.
And we have Greta.
Greta. Okay.
Yep. I think those are the only specific names. People, a couple of ideas about others, but those are the specific names.
Okay. And not surprising. All right. So here we go. There they are. At times, children involved in social movements do rise to the attention of the public. Currently, the example of Greta Thunberg. She's 16-year-old when she organized the climate change strike. Black Lives Matter, Kai Aiden, 7 years old, recently been in the news. And Malala Yousafzai, at 17 years old, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014 for her activism on girls' rights to education. At 17, she was the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She'd been working on the issue since 11 years old in Pakistan when she began a blog about the Taliban eliminating education for girls. And at age 15, she had an attempt on her life, being shot by the Taliban for her activism. She recovered and, as some of you know, has continued to fight for girls' education and founded the nonprofit, the Malala Fund. Now in the right-hand corner at the bottom is Joshua Wong. More recent past was well-known activist in Hong Kong's fight for independence through the Umbrella Movement in 2014. Joshua had been involved in activism since he was 13 years old. At 15, he became co-founder of Scholarism to protest against pro-Beijing implementation of national education in Hong Kong. That protest brought more than 100,000 people to the streets. Joshua Wong has continued to fight for self-determination for Hong Kong and currently is on trial for inciting an unauthorized assembly. So he currently is showing up in the news again for that. Now, the idea of a lone protester or a charismatic leader in social movements is a common misconception, I would call it, of how movements are organized. I mean, it's amazing what these well-known activists have done. So not to take away from that, but both adults and children mobilization actually occurs more through organizations, including nonprofits and NGOs, institutions, and social networks. So because of this other image that we have, we kind of tend to think of the idea of children being involved in social movements as rare, but it's actually not that rare. Now, social movements themselves are connected to organizations, and researchers study these as SMOs, social movement organizations. Some of these do specifically involve children, even creating their own auxiliary organizations. However, actually, some social movement organizers overlook children as members, or they actively don't want them involved in the organization. Lots of reasons for that we don't have time to get into. But one movement that definitely utilized the idea of having children separate organizations was the labor movement. For example, the Junior Wobblies of the International Workers of the World. And if you can see the description on the side of that booklet, very much kind of pushing the idea of children having those same goals as the IWW. They had summer camps and summer courses for children and teenagers aged 12 to 18. And the peak of all of this with the children's group was about in the 1930s. Now, institutions such as school settings are uniquely environments that children might become involved in social movements. From civil rights history, the case of children involved in school desegregation that's perhaps most well known are the students that came to be known as the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas. Facing counter protesters hurling abuse at the students as they tried to attend Central High, they had to be protected by the US Army. Now, these students ranged in age from 15 to 17 years old. A less well-known desegregation case in 1960 was 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who had to be escorted by federal marshals to desegregate an elementary school in New Orleans. Child activists can share their firsthand accounts, as has Ruby Bridges once they're adults, and many continue to fight against school injustice. Okay, chat moment. If you're an adult listening to this, do you have any memory of being involved in a social movement as a child? So if so, think about that, put that in the chat. We can talk about this more during the discussion, but you could go ahead and share that now in the chat if you like. Any kind of memory of being in a social movement as a child.
So Diane, also in the chat was someone had mentioned the Parkland school shooting survivors became
yes, that,
yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yes. And I will be talking about that, but thanks for telling me that.
Yep.
That's good. Okay. All right. And speaking of that, the whole idea of the school strikes, we think of that as sort of a recent thing with Greta and, again, Parkland, but school strikes are not new. In 1911, UK working class students organized and led school strikes in 62 towns over the poor conditions of their schools and of the corporal punishment they received as working class students. Strikers were 5 years old up to 13 years old. And there's some account even of a 3-year-old involved. So at least one report of a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old that were brought to court for strikes involved in that case. 16-year-old Barbara Johns organized a protest of 450 students over the segregated and substandard high school education in Prince Edwards County, Virginia. She describes organizing the strike in her own words. The plan was to assemble together the student council members. From this, we would formulate plans to go on strike. We would make signs and I would give a speech stating our dissatisfaction, and we would march out of the school, and people would hear us and see us and understand our difficulty and would sympathize with our plight. The strike went on for 2 weeks. Barbara Johns, the other student strikers, and their families enlisted support from the national NAACP and became one of the 5 cases the US Supreme Court considered that resulted in the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, legally overturning school segregation. Now, despite having adult allies after the strike began, Johns said of their involvement, "We knew we had to do it ourselves, and that if we had asked for adult help before taking the first step, we would have been turned down." In 2008, a memorial sculpture of Barbara Johns, leading fellow student strikers, was included with 3 other statues at the Virginia Civil Rights Memorial. So schools definitely connect to larger issues, and student activism can end up working toward legislative changes and social awareness on a larger platform. And for example, as someone brought up already, the Parkland students organizing March for Our Lives and getting involved in the fight for gun reform. And then, of course, the school strikes for climate action and getting involved in that. These student activists often make coalitions with existing nonprofit organizations or social movement organizations that are working in these areas. So the idea that schools are somehow cut off or separate from larger social movements is certainly not accurate. Even clashes over curriculum are serious issues. The consequences for child protesters can be deadly. The Soweto uprising in 1976, there were 20,000 students protesting against apartheid, a system of segregation of Black South Africans by the white minority. They were specifically protesting also about being forced to use Afrikaans language in the schools, the language of the white minority oppressors in the apartheid system. The protests met with deadly violence from the authorities, with estimates of up to 700 killed and thousands injured. Many of these were children. A memorial and museum was opened in 2002 in memory of the first child protester to be shot, 12-year-old Hector Peterson. Okay, take a breath on that. Families deserve a close look and vary as to each case. I consider this to be at times something that we would call mutual resistance. Families may be a way that children become involved, or sometimes they actually prevent children from getting involved. Angelica Montoya et al. Has found that children of the Zapatista movement are considered partners in their resistance. The roles within the family, school, the larger community, and the movement are as respected, active political subjects. We can also think about the case of displaced families and refugee families sharing their fate. Cursive Kallio conducted extensive interviews of Iraqi, Afghan, and Somali refugee families in 2018 and identified a familial agency that is utilized through the extreme challenges individuals and families face as refugees. Kallio considers all family members equally as political subjects with capacities to political agency. Now we see at the bottom here too that children sometimes come out and support their parents. In this case, we see child picketers with signs referencing their parents or relatives on strike. Protest in 2018 against family separation at the border developed later into a more permanent campaign using the protest message as the name. Families Belong Together is now a campaign of the National Domestic Alliance, working with 250 organizations to fight family separation and promote unity, dignity, and compassion for all children and families. Children protest with their families, which emphasizes the movement's message. Now, in some cases, children may be the ones to mobilize their family into social movement causes. One child activist had researched animal abuse at SeaWorld at school She educated her family and had them watch the film Blackfish and talked about this with their siblings about how they wanted to get involved. And they came with her as she gave a speech at a protest. An 11-year-old who wanted to protest the Burnaby Mountain Pipeline in Canada gained the support of her family to accompany her. Now, these parents ended up getting a lot of criticism in the press for their action. In response to reporters, her mother relayed the conversation she had had with her daughter. I told her, if you're really that brave and this is truly what you want to do, I will support you. I will go with you and I will make sure you're safe. Her father stated, our daughter stands up for her beliefs. Another way we can think about this too is the nonprofit organization PFLAG that was formed as a parent of LGBT children support group. And this has turned not only into personal allies, but active advocates of the LGBTQ rights with over 400 chapters in the US. Now, there are religious organizations of specific faiths and interfaith organizations that actively foster connections between social issues and children's involvement. The Unitarian Universalist Church put the principles of the church into child-friendly poster, and children are actively brought into social justice campaigns. The Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences has initiated a Schools for Trees program to actively involve Muslim children in the environmental movement based on ideals of faith. In this picture we see in the middle here, children in Indonesia are planting acres of trees to offset the effects of deforestation, and they've become a part of the Indonesian eco-pesantren movement and larger push for eco-dakwah, which is the connection between religion and the environmental awareness within Islam. Now, the pro-life movement organizes pro-life camps for middle school to high school students, but they also recruit 14 to 18-year-olds through churches and religious schools to attend the annual National March for Life pilgrimage in DC. The March for Life holds a youth rally and a Mass for Life. Individual archdioceses around the country have youth groups attend this protest event. According to the organizers, there's an estimated 500,000 in this age range of 14 to 18-year-olds that attend this event. The organizational aspect of the church, definitely you can see in these pictures, they are pushing it as a generational activism. The signs that you see here, I am the pro-life generation, are, pre-printed off signs and a slogan that the pro-life movement has come up with. And then I guess this is Snapchat. I think I know my logos. This is a Generation Life, another push toward the idea of this generation. And as you can see, also with this flyer here, they provide transportation and busing students to this protest. Now, social clubs for children, sometimes these are just basically about civic awareness or community projects, but some go further into social movement activism. For example, Youth Organizing Disabled and Proud is a social club, but they also provide training in disability activism, and members participate in activist events. As you can see here, the goals are to connect, and this is the social aspect. Youth with disabilities get to network with each other and organizations, and they have a lot of social activities. But also they help develop leadership skills, and they educate other people out in the community and also youth with disabilities on the disability rights movement, disability culture and pride, organizing, action, and advocacy. And again, they're out there doing events. You can see this picture of a protester, and then also this flyer above, as you can see, Disability Resist. This is not just a social club that meets and just does fun, nice things. They're also involved in the social movement. As one participant stated, I absolutely love YO. It's an organization that not only fights for change, but makes change look believable. I'm always amazed by the ideas you all have, and even more amazed when it's accomplished. Never in my life did I think I'd learn about our culture and history ever. I'm also more eager to fight more myself just because of YO. Now, children have also started their own social clubs, their own nonprofit organizations for social change. They've modified existing ones. The Radical Monarchs is a reaction to the apolitical Girl Scout troops. This group, founded in 2014 for girls of color 9 through 13, they earn badges in radical healing, Black Lives Matter, radical media, and participating in the Trans March in San Francisco. Another case is Rachel Parent, who began researching genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, when she was 11 years old. And by 14, she founded the anti-GMO organization Kids Right to Know in Toronto. As she stated in an interview with Lang and O'Leary, a well-known public affairs program, she views her organization as autonomous but connected to the larger anti-GMO movement. When co-host Lang asked Parent if she worried whether she was being used by the larger environmentalist movement, Parent answered, "We're a complete part of it, but we're separate in a way because we're fighting not only for our food, but our future, for nature and our ecosystem. So I believe we're completely different in a way, but we add to the group." Now, after unsuccessfully challenging her knowledge on the issue and her autonomy as an activist throughout the interview, O'Leary then dismissed her activism at a different level, specifically her age. His final comment to her was that he hoped that she would age out of her passionate commitment. In response, Rachel laughed, smiled, and shook her head, voicing an emphatic no. Now in her 20s, she's still involved in the movement and also started another nonprofit, Gen Earth Events, an environmental film platform. So social media also facilitates children's access to being in organizations or, becoming a part of them. It makes it easier for sure. But I also want to point out that children were involved in organizations well before social media. But it's good to know certain organizations might rely on this more. And now these two climate change nonprofit organizations, Zero Hour and Green Hope, are youth-led and are a good example of the role of social media. In 2018, a march on Washington, D.C. with sister marches around the world had been carried out by Zero Hour, organized by the then 15-year-olds founder Jamie Margolin and Nadia Nazar. They organized via social media, including this was how they ended up meeting each other in the first place. Now, another climate leader is Kehkashan Basu from Dubai, where she began her activism. She's now in Canada. She founded Green Hope at age 12 with an international organization, or it is an international organization that educates and mobilizes youth for environmental justice. She was presented with the International Children's Peace Prize in 2016 for her work, as she explains her participation in social movements. When I was 7, I saw an image of a dead bird with its stomach full of plastic, and that really disturbed me. I decided when I was 8, I was old enough to start doing something on my own. So I planted a tree, and there has been no looking back since then. I was 12 when I went to the Rio 20 Earth Summit in Brazil, and I saw that out of 50,000 delegates, I was the youngest, and there were only 5 others under 18. I really did not like that the summit was preparing for the future without young people who would be most affected. When I returned to Dubai, I started the foundation so that young people could give other young people the opportunity and platform to learn about sustainability challenges and to mitigate them. Okay. So, given that children do participate in social movements, hopefully I've made that abundantly clear, and they are socio-political actors, what about their rights as citizens? Are children covered by the larger human rights? Are their rights just about making their voice heard? What age range, etc.? Let's take a look at children's rights. Now, the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child was adopted in 1924 by the League of Nations. The founder of Save the Children Fund drafted the document. And as you can see from the language, and I'll show you the rest of it, it's just 4 main points. The language will tend to be very much about protection. As we can see here, the child that is hungry must be fed, the child that's sick must be nursed, must be first to receive relief in times of distress, must be protected against every form of exploitation. So the rights of children initially were really focused on protection, very much protection oriented only. At the same time, you had child savers movement where juvenile courts were formed to try to keep children from just being punished through the adult courts. A lot of organizations were created by adult leaders that were for children. This entirely was a social problems perspective and almost conflated children altogether as being social problems and in society and what to do about them. So this attitude still exists, but it's definitely more challenged currently. Now, many children's rights documents have been created since the Geneva Declaration of Rights. However, the significant one is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that was adopted in 1989 for signature and ratification by countries around the world. Often referred to as CRC, I will be using that, and that's what I'm talking about. So the CRC is made up of 54 articles. I'm only going to be discussing briefly 3 of them. All right, so chat time. What countries do you think have still not ratified this yet? Or maybe you think all of them have. But if you think any countries might not have ratified this yet, let us know in the chat. What countries do you think may not have ratified this yet? No cheating.
We have some obvious
Oh,
front
oh,
winners here, Diane. Do you want me to wait? You want me to hold
yeah,
it?
hold that thought. Give more time, but that's good. I'm glad people are weighing in on that. So hold on, and we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so Article 12, I want to talk about this because this is the focus when we talk about children's right. It tends to be Article 12 that NGOs and nonprofits that work with children are going to talk about. Basically, it's the idea that the child who is capable of forming his or her own views have the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child, the views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. Again, you most often will hear about Article 12, and this is what Article 12 is about. However, other ones we should take a quick look at that involve social movements are Article 13 and Article 15. So Article 13 is guaranteeing children the right to freedom of speech in any media, and of course restricted by laws concerning rights of others, public order, public health, morals. This is the same as adults' rights to freedom of speech. There are some limits and restrictions. Now the same with Article 15, freedom of peaceable assembly, and again, this relates to protest and social movements and is somewhat restricted just as it is for adults. Okay, so now what is the results of the chat? Now we might have more people out. What countries do you think might not have ratified the declaration yet?
Well, we have a lot of votes for the United States. And then I would say Russia and China are the follow-ups, but definitely overwhelmingly US. So
okay, no other countries, right?
China and Russia were mentioned. That's it.
Oh, right, China or Russia. Okay, well that's good. You know, so China, Russia, and the U.S. Let's say that. All right. Okay, so as we see, children have the right to dissent in their view and protest according to the Declaration of the Rights of the Child with some limitation, and of course, to the extent that rights are upheld in any country. For those of you that voted that it was just the US, you are right. It pays to be cynical, I guess, right? Or realistic. So the US is the only country to not ratify the Children's Declaration of Rights, and this is largely due to parental rights groups. One of the main ones is parentalrights.org. They are working on putting a parental rights amendment into the US Constitution and fighting the ratification of the CRC. As you can tell by the slogan, protecting children by empowering parents. In their mind, the problem is that parents need more rights and certainly not children, and that then it would be the parents to help out children however they see fit. All right, NGOs and children. This is just a small smattering of the NGOs that are involved with children. And they may work exclusively with children's issues, raise funds, or sponsor programs for children, but many of them don't directly involve children in goal setting or organizational operation, let alone have children on staff or anything like that. Also, some NGOs do not think children should be involved in social movements. They may be interested in them having civic awareness, but that's a different matter. Overall, though, we do see a shifting landscape from this whole notion of only protecting or saving children to becoming allies, from adult-centric, what we would call, to child-centric in these NGOs and organizations. Because of the CRC in particular, participation is becoming less strategic and more active participation of children in these NGOs. Let's take a little deeper dive into this. The influence on the CRC of the influence of CRC on NGOs, and again, in particular, Article 12, is that they do reporting on how they've implemented the CRC in their NGO for children. I like this picture of this guide because, as you see, it's a guide for NGOs to for CRC reporting. And in the picture here, it kind of looks as if the adults are showing what the rights are. And we do have some writing here by a child. But all around, you'll see the children with these little speech bubbles, right? So they're all, giving their thoughts, their opinions about their rights. And this is kind of the emphasis quite often in participation, is the idea of giving children voice. And it's the predominant thinking about how the CRC would be enacted, like, getting the input or finding out what children think their rights are, and then, helping them to formulate them, sometimes putting the rights into child-friendly language, etc. And that seems to be the focus of the NGOs on participation. We see another example here. This call for NGOs seems to be directed toward adults who might have some contact with children who are deprived of liberty. And then I highlighted this one section of what they're looking for. They're looking for information about children's experiences, views, and perspectives of deprivation of liberty in your country or countries. And again, what we see here is the idea of just looking for input as to the views. All right. So despite moving in the direction of including children in the sort of participation a little bit more, there's still some very controversial issues existing, such as child labor. There is a movement for the elimination of child labor, and many adult-led organizations focus on this issue. The International Labor Organization has outlined types of work children should not engage in, particularly worst forms of child labor, and these organizations follow these guidelines and work toward that. Now, one example is Global March Against Child Labor. It's one of the older ones since 1998. They first marched in 103 countries. The founder, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work, Kailash Satyarthi, he is clearly the dominant figure in this group. You see him in these pictures in the middle of children. And also, I want to direct your attention to the bottom left picture, where some of the marches are also just adults who are marching for children, in a sense. And so it is a very much sort of an adult-led organization. Children are sometimes involved in the marches, but it's in very much a strategic sense of the way that it is, the participation is. Now, beyond adult-led organizations on this topic, there are working children's unions in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and South America that are by and for children, and they are led by the children. The largest children's union is Bhima Sangha with over 20,000 children. Children's unions have clashed with adult-led organizations over stopping child labor, since what they want is work with protection for workers. As explained by Uchangama, a 13-year-old girl when she became state president of the organization, with the help of the Sangha, many children are now trying to participate, develop skills, and stand on their own feet. Through my participation in Bhima Sangha, many children who are members of the organization are actively participating in various fields, programs, and discussions. As a result of the work of the organization, the situation of working children has improved in my area. Earlier, working children were never paid the right wages for their labor. Now they demand this as a right and have actually obtained better working conditions and better wages as a result. Now, another strong union is in Peru. It's been researched by Jessica Taft, and I'll plug her new book here, The Kids Are in Charge. This working children's movement has been developing for 40 years, and children are not only involved in establishing protections and rights for work, but also wider political involvement in other social institutions as well. The Peruvian National Movement of Working Children and Adolescents incorporates close to 10,000 working children from around the country and has its own organizational structures and practices. So what's the role of adult allies in NGOs and nonprofits with these child-led organizations? There's a dynamic relationship of the children activists and adult allies. They work together as partners, and they're attempting to move beyond just hearing children's perspective and voice, and more toward active participation as guaranteed by the CRC. And here's a picture of a negotiation session with authorities by child leaders of the unions. And again, this is expanded well beyond work issues, but to other life issues. So how do we start seeing children as participants in social movements? First of all, we have to acknowledge these connections to organizations and institutions and see the range of participation. There's strategic, by default, or active child participation existing on a pretty regular basis. Article 13 and 15 need to also be recognized by NGOs and nonprofits in terms of social movement activity, not just Article 12, which is just an expression of children's views, which is great, but it doesn't go far enough. There needs to be a critical examination of CRC implementation and inclusivity of all children. Now, this is starting to happen. There's definitely been a concern about this idea of a universal child and rights being sort of organized around that idea. So they're trying to move past that because formal civic involvement is not within easy reach of the many children who've been displaced or severely marginalized. Children growing up in displacement camps or migrants may turn to social movement organizations, or they may have difficulty participating at all. When we understand children's participation in social movements, we're able to re-examine all these ideas of agency, mobilization, and rights. And this is much needed. All right. So thank you very much for letting me talk to you about all this, and let's discuss.
So Diane, do you want to stop sharing your screen, or you already?
Yep, I'm out. It's such a, let's see. It's such a weird experience doing a talk on Zoom.
I know.
When to see people. Okay. Hello.
We'll be back soon, right? We will be back soon.
Yeah. So yes. So hello, everyone. Well, just seeing you.
Put your questions in the chat. You can also use any of the reactions on the bottom if you'd like to ask your question orally. Looks like Laura. So let me go ahead and Laura, you should be able to go ahead.
Hey, Diane, this is a really fascinating talk. Really looking forward to having a chance to read the book once the semester is over.
Yes.
One question I had for you is about sort of the long-term effects of children's participation in social movements. Because one of the things we know about activism is that there's sort of that on-ramp to it, that low-stakes activism prepares people to engage in more high stakes activism over time. And certainly some of the things that you were talking about are actually deliberate socialization in activism. Both some of the things that are happening through youth groups and the youth organized, but also some of the adult organized things like some of the, for example, pro-life movement activities. So I was wondering if in the book you have anything to say in it about this, or if you have any thoughts that you wanted to share with us about long-term effects.
On the children or on social movements, or either one, long-term effects of either or both? You're like, what? Okay, you're open. Long-term effects for the children. One of the things that you might have noticed that I was trying to stress here is that some of the child participants are, oh, I see you can't unmute. Okay, Laura's stuck. Oh no,
No.
that's terrible. So one of the things is the idea that for children, this isn't just something that they have done once or twice and that's it. For some of them, it is a lifelong commitment. And that's very valuable in terms also of the story that tells us about social movements over the life course. So I think, that's something interesting to explore. And in terms of, I guess, the long-term effects on social movements, again, that then you have these very dedicated social movement activists, for life, basically, right? So I guess that certainly would affect social movements long term. But although I emphasize that, there's also the case where children might have been involved either as a strategic participant or a participant by default and want nothing more to do with it ever again after that. So I don't want to, over exaggerate the idea that people then, that children definitely become, as you said, socialized. But I think we also have to think about the fact that they also can choose at any time to not be involved in social movements or to change the direction of their participation. So I think, that happens as well.
Yeah, although I would add that there are structures within some of these that make it more coercive. For example, with some of the family activities or school organized activities,
Yeah.
it may be difficult or socially isolating for students to refuse their participation, or for youth to refuse their participation.
Exactly. And vice versa. There's certainly structures that will prevent children that might want to be involved in social movements from being involved. And so, and that's one thing that's a big debate right now with children's studies and looking at child participation is that, initially in the 1990s and onward, there was this complete focus on children's agency and how they're social and political actors and everything. And then now there's been some pushback to like, well, wait a minute, there is structural constraints. But the only thing I think I would always like to throw in there is that's true often for adults as well. I mean, we have structural constraints also in our relationship with social movements, whether being involved or how we're involved or what have you. So yeah, but anyway, yeah. And again, while they're children, they may end up having to go along. Doesn't mean that they're going to be active. That's why I set up the whole participants by default. You could be dragged along to a protest and just stand there with your sign. Yeah, whatever. And I think that's something that we should look at, as well.
So Diane, I'm curious because I've looked at, volunteerism and volunteerism rates and who volunteers in the United States anyway. And there is something that says the people who volunteer tend to come from more affluent families, tend to have the ability to have flexibility in their careers or in how they structure their lives. Is the same kind of thing in social movements? Like, do we see children involved in social movements at all different levels, either income, socioeconomic, whatever, or are there certain demographics who are more likely to participate? And I'm just curious because we see that in volunteerism.
Right. I think the difference is social movement activity is, sort of outside the structural, formalized constraints. And I think worldwide, you would not see the same kind of thing as you would, civic involvement. And that's sort of, in some cases, the reason we have social movements, right? Is that, groups that are more marginalized, that are, not in the demographic that you describe, that is their way of participating or to, get their point across, is through social movements.
Mm. So other questions from folks who are attending? If you want to give me a hand raise or anything, you can ask your question directly to Diane. You're able to unmute yourself now, so.
And then I'm also curious because I'm not really very coordinated to read chat while I'm doing other stuff, but did anybody share their story of being a child in a social movement in the chat earlier?
There was
If so-
definitely some folks who did that, especially around volunteering and fundraising.
Okay. And so if somebody wanted, people wanted to share that now too, that would be interesting to hear about. Anybody? I know for myself, doing this work, I did think about myself as a child, and reflected on that. And I always recall as adults, my sister was pointing out to me one time some of the things that I was doing or involved in. And she was like, how did you know how to do that? Like, why did you care about that particular thing, or, the environment, or why did you do this or that? And I again, to me, it was like, because it just was, I did. So it's been interesting to reflect on that whole experience too, as well. So I assume that some of you probably had some experiences too. Are there any that you think we can share from the chat that people wrote?
Yeah, I mean, I think some people kind of shared that they, well, I don't know if we want to, it's up to you guys if you want to tell your story, but I know that we had some people, Derek mentioned that he had done some political campaigning a little bit. Laura mentioned that she had gone to some rallies and done some letter writing campaigns. Zena, and I apologize if I'm saying your name incorrectly, brought to a few trades-based strikes with the union organizer with her dad. Althea shared she had volunteered with the Black Panther breakfast program as a teenager. It's pretty cool. I don't know, Althea, I know you're still on. Some people have had to drop off, but Althea, you're still here. I don't know if you want to share that with us or not.
Well, I don't know if there's much to say. I mean, that was in the 60s, of course, and at the time it didn't seem like a big deal, because it's just what everyone was doing. We were involved with the movement, and so that was one way to be of help. What's curious to me now sometimes is how my parents, who are really kind of like these conservative Christian people, let me do that. But just like they let me read anything I wanted to read, they let me pretty much volunteer like I wanted to also.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Althea.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share my experiences too.
Please do.
I had lots of them, but actually elementary school, I had a teacher in my Catholic elementary school who was very into peace movement stuff. This is a shocker. I got socialized to be and at the more volunteer or away from what we would consider more activism, I was trained as a peer mediator. But on the other hand, we were also involved in anti-apartheid stuff. So I learned like songs about freeing Nelson Mandela as an elementary school student, and we wrote letters about that. And I went on and continued the letter writing stuff. I was involved in Amnesty International in high school and became the high school president for that. So, I like, as you say, Diane, thinking about like the ways in which you can look at your own biography and trace out those connections and how those interests build over time.
Right. But I also think, like Althea said, is the whole idea that sometimes we don't even think of these times from our childhood because it was just like, well, of course, of course we were doing that, and then that's why I wanted to set up the different types of participation because those count as well. So sometimes this idea, we do really have a very narrow ideas about what social movement activity is and what the idea of participation is. And it's like, if you don't have a sign and out on the street, then you're not a social movement activist. And there's so many other ways that people are involved in that. And the whole idea to me too is almost offensive, the idea that, somehow adults have full awareness and when they're involved in social movements, but children, how could they? Because it's sort of like there's many adults that don't kind of have a lot of awareness, understanding of social movements. Maybe they, again, get dragged to a social movement and they don't really, know. Whereas many, as I hopefully shared and have convinced, if anybody needed convincing, many children, even at very young ages, are very aware and understand issues and could actively participate. So I think there shouldn't necessarily be this idea with social movements that all adults automatically are aware and fully participating or able to fully participate, that is.
There was a question in the chat, Diane, that said, follow-up reading, more research, if they read your book, kind of other suggestions where they can go to kind of dig a little bit further in this topic. Any suggestions, recommendations, research? You mentioned one book in your presentation already, the folks that are doing that in Peru, I think. Any other folks they could be following?
Well, you could look through my reference section of the book. And you could find plenty of other ones that would be specific to whatever topic you want, and not to sort of toot my own horn, but the whole reason that I wrote this book is I had initially written an article, I don't know how long ago that was, but on this topic, and I at that time, again, there was nothing out there on this topic at all. And so I just thought, okay, I'm sure, this is, people are going to see this and start writing about the idea of children and social movements. But then all over these years, I have not seen anything in the social movement research on it. So I was like, there's so many cases that I keep adding to my file folder of this, and it's just too amazing, all these cases to not bring to light. So that's why I did it. So I'm not sure that I could say, oh yeah, here's this whole other book, that completely talks about children and social movements. It depends on, again, if you want to learn more about children's rights issues, there's lots on that. And again, you can look through the references. If you want to learn more about just in general children's agency, then that's why I was directing you to children's studies literature. And that entire literature is good about that. So I don't know. I'm not trying to just say, just read my book, but
But Diane, do you think
you can use it? I do cite other works, and you can use that to find out what you're interested in and go forth and look.
given the topic, is there likely to be a second edition in a couple of years to update us? Because these movements are going on, right? They could.
Exactly. I hope so. I'm always, it's kind of I don't know, like each month I'll see some case that I'm just like, oh, wow, that would have been great to add to it, or something like that. So yeah, hopefully.
And I put the link in that you could buy it on Amazon, or at least, you get all the information. So if you can source it from there. Do you know if it's available in the NAU bookstore? I don't know.
Yeah. And a couple of things about its availability. I'm hoping that it comes out in paperback soon, because right now it's just in hardback and an ebook. and it was supposed to be coming out in paperback. But, part of this has been, the book came out last March, smack dab when, everything shut down, the pandemic started. I remember the day when I got my complimentary copies, and it was in a box on my porch, and it had rained, so the box it was just so like emblematic of like, yes, your book came out in the middle, the pandemic has started, so whatever. So I don't know that it's even at the NIU library at this point yet, but you can also, the ebook is pretty affordable, sort of. And then again, hopefully it comes out in paperback soon. I don't know about the NIU bookstore if they have it yet. They're probably not going to have the hardback, I'm assuming. And also, I really wouldn't ask any of you to buy the hardback. That's too expensive. Wait, get the ebook or wait for the paperback. Yeah. So thank you for
Great.
putting those in.
Yep. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Let's see if anybody else has a hand raised.
Oh,
Laura, do
Laura.
you have another question? Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to have 10,000 questions since I'm a social movement scholar.
And Laura, just so you know, you might want to get the hardback copy because you're in the book.
Ah, wow.
Yeah, your research on NGOs and social movements.
Yeah. So the question I wanted to ask you is sort of what you think the big takeaway is for social movement scholars. So people who are focused on social movements more broadly, what would you like them to know about children and social movements? Should this be changing our thinking about how movements work?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I did for this talk was not focus as much on that aspect, but in the book, there's like an entire chapter on social movement theories and how the idea of these types of participation could enhance the existing theories. So I think you'll appreciate that, or social movement theorists would. But for this, I wanted it to be more general, without going into explaining political process model or rational choice. I didn't want to go into that. But I do in the book direct a big chunk of that to social movement researchers, because that's where this is missing the most. I mean, there are, like I said, I mentioned Ruby Bridges, other activists have books out. The first slide that I showed, I had this little picture that was from a children's book with a little picture of children protesting. And I would say that's, weirdly enough, that is an amazing source, children's books, because there's this trend to have a lot of progressive ideas and topics in children's books now, and there is a lot of children's books on children and social movements. So I would just look for children's books and type in activism, and you probably find a lot of really cool books about that. And again, firsthand accounts are certainly good. But to your question again, Laura, is yes, I would like social movement theorists to include children, for one thing, when they're glaringly, obviously in a social movement that you're studying, you might want to mention children. And then also, like I said, the whole idea of what we think of as agency, what we think of the capabilities of people to be involved in social movements. I think once you really start looking at how children are able to do that, it would make you start rethinking some of those ideas about what we mean by agency, and what we mean by being a social and political activist, like this whole idea of the families, right? The whole idea we have about agency is very much based on this whole, Western rational man idea, the individual, right? Instead of the interconnectedness that most of us have, with families, with organizations, with friends. And, that's a way that you can also have agency, You don't have to be the individual having agency. So the idea that a family, like the one researcher talked about familial agency, you don't have to be the lone wolf. And that's why I think these stories of like Greta, Malala are very, much grabbing public attention, because like, oh, here's this one person doing this. And it's like, and that's why it grabs our attention, because that's our idea of agency. Mobilization, that same thing, is the idea that people, we know this in social movement researcher, that people get involved through networks and all of that. But just the idea too that children have been left out of that social movement research, because there's the idea that they don't have any access to social movements. And that's why I tried to go through all of those different institutions of like, they have plenty of access through all of these different organizations and institutions, is where they have that access. They might not be like, hey, I need to hop on the next plane to DC and get involved in this big protest. No, but what they're doing is through these everyday organizations, they actually have access. And then again, children's rights, and just looking at that from the whole idea of rights perspective in general. Again, that problem of having the universal model of an individual and their rights, and putting that into social movement research needs to be changed as well for adults.
I'm wondering too, if like our ethics practices don't work against us in understanding children in movement.
Oh, yeah. Right.
We have institutional review boards, for those of you who are not academics, that oversee the research ethics. And there's an additional pretty serious level of scrutiny for any research that involves children.
Right.
And this goes back to this idea that children are not full agents.
Right.
That until you reach adulthood, you don't have this full ability to consent on your own. But it does mean that by default, we cut children out of a lot of our studies.
Right.
Because it takes a significantly longer period of time to get approval for a study that would include children, and especially for one that would include children incidentally. Like, I would interview people who are under 18 if they're there. So I know a lot of people in their social movement study designs will ask, are you 18? And that's an excluded.
Yeah, the IRB, yeah, the consent form right there. Usually it says 18 or older, right off the bat, So yeah, I agree. I understand. Again, with my book, I didn't interview any children directly. And so I was very well aware of that issue, but there's many ways to get well. So I don't think that really prevents social movement researchers from putting that data into their research. And if they're interested in, specifically doing a study with children, then again, I would go to the children's studies literature, and they do a lot of work with children and participation directly. And I would look at the methods of those researchers, because they have very innovative methods to work with children as equal, as allies, and not, in this patronizing way. And so I would definitely recommend looking at children's studies methods, especially, the more recent ones, and also seeing that it's possible, right? Because the children participation literature is vast. So it's just, what's interesting about that literature is, as much as they're all about children's agency, children's participation, even there, I wasn't seeing anything directly on social movements, which is, again, why I went ahead and wrote the book, because it was like, they're all about all of these very active ways of participation in children's studies, but they're not talking about social movements either. So, yeah, but it's possible, Laura. So I don't think we have an excuse.
Well, I was also thinking, as Laura was commenting about methodology, is that so much of the activity, I imagine, today is also occurring on YouTube and other social media channels. And that's all available data that that's out there. So how people, their language or their activities is already being documented every time they move. So you wouldn't necessarily have to go out and speak to them. All of that information is already online somewhere.
Exactly.
Or
Yeah.
different methodology, but possible.
Right, right. And then the historical cases too, I think are important. Like if you're studying a particular movement, you could, you know, trace it back or look at, earlier examples, sort of like with the school strikes. People are just like, oh, let's talk about this. When I was writing this, the other thing that drove me a little crazy writing this is that everyone was like, kind of like, oh, what about Greta? I think I already mentioned this, and you need to put Greta in there. I'm like, yeah, Greta is going to be in the book or whatever, of course, But the whole idea that there are these historical cases, out there that can be included and talked about, and that I think that's kind of important to show continuity. This is nothing new that children are involved in social movements. So that, but that has its own issues, just like historical research does in general in trying to get data. But it's there, it is out there.
Thank you, Diane. I don't see any other further questions.
Okay.
What are you working on right now? Are you still, is this an area where you're going to continue to work on, or are you working on any fun projects that you care to share?
Well, my interests are always so all over the place, but probably my next interest has to go back to my Finnish American project that is based in this community on Finn towns, and also the idea of immigrant commemoration involved with that, trying to combine different immigrant groups that are in the same space, that follow one immigrant group might follow another immigrant group into a particular space. And then how can you do combined commemorations? I guess that's kind of what I need to catch back up on. That's a whole other thing. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But thank you for asking about that. But again,
I love that you have varied interest, Diane. I'm with you.
My other topic is on bugs, so hey, I won't even talk about that. Bugs in society, but
I don't know. But
yeah.
It sounds fun.
It is. But anyway, so yeah, I don't know if you're able to share save the chat for me. Oh, good, because I see lots of chats there, and I'm like, oh, I want to find out what people were saying.
Yep, I will absolutely save it. So let me turn off the recording.
Thank you for